44 years after Britain joined the European Economic Community, the historic Brexit divorce proceedings get underway. And the US Army says it's fairly likely one of its own airstrikes killed more than 100 civilians in Mosul. We'll examine the fallout from the biggest stories of the past 7 days. This is Insight Review. Welcome to Insight Review, our look back at the most clicked and shared and read stories over the past 7 days. On today's programme, a defining moment in Europe's history. It's official. For the first time since the EU's creation, a member state is now in the process of leaving. We'll take a look at what the triggering of Article 50 might mean for Britain as she floats adrift on uncharted waters. Plus, French presidential candidate François Fillon's wife, formally charged with embezzlement. We'll examine those stories and others with our guests, the journalist Farah Nayeri and the deputy editor of the Daily Express, Michael Booker. But first, here's Insight's Ty Genwright with what you need to know about what happened this week. 7 days in 60 seconds.
Britain formally began the process of leaving the European Union, with Prime Minister Theresa May triggering Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty in a letter to the President of the European Council. A senior US Army commander conceded it was likely an American airstrike was responsible for the deaths of more than 100 civilians in West Mosul just over a fortnight ago. Donald Trump continued to roll back legislation from the Obama era aimed at tackling climate change. The US president signed an executive order eliminating Obama's landmark Clean Power Plan. Floods hit parts of Queensland in northern Australia in the wake of Cyclone Debbie. In the state's capital, Brisbane, the monthly rain average of 200 millimetres fell in just 2 hours. And the South African anti-apartheid activist Ahmed Kathrada has died after a short illness. The 87-year-old spent 18 years in jail on Robben Island alongside Nelson Mandela. But first, after 4 decades of ever closer integration with its neighbours, the UK officially began divorce proceedings with the European Union this week. A 2-year negotiation process will now begin, during which a new trade deal with the bloc will be forged and around 19,000 individual pieces of EU legislation will be transferred across to the UK's statute books. Let's take you through some of the key events from earlier this week. The 6-page letter invoking Article 50 was signed and sealed by the British Prime Minister Theresa May. Sir Tim Barrow, the UK's permanent representative in Brussels, who has now been dubbed Britain's best-paid postman, hand-delivered the letter to the EU Council President Donald Tusk. In the letter, Mrs May writes, "As I have said before, the decision was no rejection of the values we share as fellow Europeans, nor was it an attempt to do harm to the European Union or any of the remaining member states. On the contrary, the United Kingdom wants the European Union to succeed and prosper. Instead, the referendum was a vote to restore, as we see it, our national self-determination."
The Article 50 process is now underway, and in accordance with the wishes of the British people, the United Kingdom is leaving the European Union.
There is no reason to pretend that this is a happy day, neither in Brussels nor in London. After all, most Europeans, including almost half the British voters, wish that we would stay together, not drift apart.
The 2 years of negotiations will be led by the EU Commission's negotiator, Michel Barnier, and his department. Task Force 50 will be responsible for the preparation and conduct of the negotiations. Well, joining us on the programme today, the journalist Farah Nayeri and the deputy editor of the Daily Express newspaper, Michael Booker. You're very welcome. Theresa May can say she kept to her timetable. She was going to do this before the end of March, and just about she got it done.
She did get it done. It has been really 9 months since the British people voted in a referendum and expressed the desire, well, a majority of them expressed the desire to leave. So to them, it seems like an awfully long time to wait for the process to start. And of course, as we know, the timetable is really, really tight, because according to the EU, it's going to take something like 6 months for the departure of the British to be presented to parliaments in the other 27 countries for ratification. So that leaves about a year, roughly, to get this all negotiated. It's an awfully tight schedule.
And there's even an argument about how they do it, Michael, isn't it? Which bit comes first? Do we have conversations in parallel or in series, one after each other? Yeah, well, if they're struggling over negotiating how to do the negotiation, it does look as though it's going to be trudging through a swamp for at least 2 years. But I think, it's a cliche, I keep saying it is uncharted territory. No one quite knows how it's going to work. Are they going to do the trade deal at the same time as the deal to, preserve EU citizens' rights in here and our citizens' rights in the EU? We don't know. And there's going to be some tough talking. And it was interesting to see that there is tough talking from certain people. Jean-Claude Juncker, particularly, is saying, it's going to be terrible. Brexit's going to be awful for the British. It's a terrible thing that's happened. Donald Tusk, he did seem genuinely upset. And even in our offices at the Daily Express, where a lot of our readers, the majority of our readers, wanted out of the EU, there was a sense of when we saw Donald Tusk, he said, well, there is, he has got a soft spot for us. He is genuinely worried and he is upset that Britain is leaving. But there is 17 million people who did vote for it. They do want it to happen as soon as possible, but it does look as though it's going to be a very, very difficult road from here on in. And the argument about it has to be a bad deal for the UK as a deterrent for anybody else trying to do this. This is a view I think the French particularly hold, isn't it? That they don't want it to be seen as a pretty cosy little arrangement.
I don't think that that's a view that would be held by the other 26 states and by the European Union in general. I don't think anyone wants ugly haggling for the next year and a half to go on. A bad deal will not be in the interests of anyone, to my mind, not in the interests of the UK and not in the interests of the EU. So I'm not quite sure that...
well, when I say bad deal, maybe that's sloppy shorthand. What I mean is one that's disadvantageous from a financial perspective or from a trading perspective would be that the club wants to be seen to be a good thing, and as a member of the club, you get benefits. If you're outside, you don't. They're going to want to discourage anyone else doing the same thing. Exactly. And obviously, we've had this mood music in France from Marine Le Pen talking about doing their own Brexit. She's threatening. So, they don't want that. They want it to stay together, and but at the same time, Britain does offer a lot to Europe, and there is the need to keep friendly, and they know that, and we know that. So there is going to be these negotiations ongoing. Two of the biggest economies, of course, have got elections themselves. The French have got an election. We're going to discuss that in a little while, and the German elections are not that far off either. So I suppose we're going to hear all sorts of politicking around this, because it's bound to be that candidates will be asked about Britain leaving during election campaigns.
And of course, it is a negotiation, so you're going to get, people chiming in on all sides and sounding really harsh and hard and severe. Remember, the French elections are coming up, first round April 23rd, second round a couple of weeks later, and the German elections won't be happening until late September. And you can be absolutely certain that nothing, and I mean absolutely really nothing of substance, can be negotiated until we know who the next German leader is. So Theresa May herself, she, this week was supposed to be there was the great picture there at Downing Street with the Union flag behind. That was supposed to be a victory for her, but she's got to keep an eye on the Tory right in her own party, in the Conservative Party. If she seems to be given in easily to the EU, they're going to
or there's a lack of momentum, or nothing much is happening. Yeah, because there's still probably a view abroad somewhere, isn't it? Actually, maybe this thing will never happen because it'll be so difficult to do. Let's just talk about the subtext of some of the language used in this letter, shall we? Many journalists and commentators in the UK noted that the subtext of Theresa May's letter to Donald Tusk seemed to be saying, if you can't do a deal with us on trade, then we'll make sure you're weaker on security and fighting terrorism. Theresa May has been accused of subtly hinting that if Britain does not receive a good trade deal, then the UK may withdraw its intelligence cooperation with Europe. Just look at the wording of the letter, which includes passages like, in security terms, a failure to reach agreement would mean our cooperation in the fight against crime and terrorism would be weakened. And Europe's security is more fragile today than at any time since the end of the Cold War. The words security and cooperation are mentioned more than 10 times. Trade, on the other hand, is mentioned much less. Well, let's bring in Farah and Michael on that point. Michael, are they really making a threat about withdrawing security cooperation with our nearest neighbours? I think in the opening gambits in the negotiation, there is going to be these veiled... People have said it's blackmail, but I think there is these veiled threats. I think in diplomacy, you're going to have to talk tough sometimes, and people have seen this subtext in there, and people are thinking, are they really gambling with security?
I don't think they'd go that far, but they have to make it, all the cards are on the table there. And, you know, anything is a hostage to fortune in all of this. And I think that Britain has to be seen to be talking tough, because we're going to get the same back from the EU. Like it or not, they're going to be saying some things that we don't quite stomach, particularly, and we're going to think that's blackmail. This is early stages. I think they're feeling each other out, and I think, you know, again, for the 17 million...
But they could, it occurs to me, Farah, they could play hardball back. Are they really going to tear up Interpol? Are they really going to tear up all the intelligence community relationships and things like that? It's in no one's interest to do. And that's probably one of the earliest deals you could say, leave everything pretty much as it is, change any names, rewrite the stuff, get it done.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it does seem like, you know, Theresa May doesn't have a lot of cards in her game, because this is a kind of a silly card to play, if I may, only because it's so completely counterproductive. If the UK withholds information on crime and terrorism from the other EU 27, they're going to withhold information from the UK. And citizens in both areas are going to be completely at risk.
Nobody wins, surely.
Nobody wins. And it just seems, and I do think it is a veiled threat, as Michael was saying. I mean, I do think that it's not an accident that Theresa May included that in her speech. She is clearly sending a message, but it's a very awkward message, which doesn't serve anybody's.
I mean, clearly there's some filtering of intel, isn't there? Because the Americans and the Brits have got a good relationship, been tested in the last recent weeks, and presumably not all American intel is then gets shared on. There's sort of levels of sharing and things going on. But otherwise, you'd want to know, with all the things like the migration issue, refugees coming over, the international drug market, it seems to be a no-brainer to keep the cooperation going.
I think they know that, we know that, but that letter that was full of platitudes, there had to be something in it that had a bit of concrete, a bit of steel in it.
Scrabbled around to find,
I think
put something in.
I think that's the only thing you can take from that, is they had to have something in it. I don't think it's something that they would do, but they have to. Amber Rudd, the Home Secretary, said that, you know, we are a huge part of Europol. She followed up the threat herself, because we're very good at security. That's one thing that Britain is very good at. So I think we have to use our strongest tools, our strongest, you know, threats, if you may. Otherwise, they'll see us as being weak. So I think we have to put this on the table. Otherwise, EU might think they can walk all over it.
We have the huge advantage of being an island nation, I suppose, which does make, we know, makes our borders that bit more secure, which takes us into the Northern Ireland thing. Oh, no, we won't do that today. We'll talk about that some other time. All right, stay with us. This is Insight Review. Coming up, the corruption scandal threatening to upset France's presidential election.